Janapadas associated with the second urbanization in South Asia, the political heart of Maurya and Gupta empires, and later a smaller yet still significant provincial formation under the later Guptas and the Palas. It was also the heartland of several heterodox traditions during the early historic period, most prominently the Ajivikas, Jainism, and Buddhism, and where monastic Buddhism flourished for centuries later on. Over this long arc, the political center of Magadha shifted repeatedly between present-day Rajgir, Patna, Munger, and Bihar Sharif, reflecting broader transformations in its administrative and cultural geography. Its territorial boundaries too were not static. My presentation today returns to a question I briefly addressed in my dissertation on the decline of Buddhism in eastern India. This is very much a work in progress. Rather than offering a definitive reconstruction of Magadha's territorial extent during this early medieval period, I focus on how we might arrive at such a reconstruction. Before moving further, it may be useful to briefly unpack what historians mean by the early medieval period, particularly in relation to Bihar. Conventionally, this period spans roughly from the 6th to the 13th century CE. It begins with the decline of Gupta political authority in northern India and ends with the emergence of Sultanate rule. Within Bihar, especially in the Magadha heartland, I suggest that this span can be subdivided into three broad phases that correspond to major shifts in political control, material culture, and patterns of inter-regional influence. The first phase, 6th to 8th century, saw Magad under the later Guptas alongside the powerful neighbors such as the Mokris and later the early Pratiharas. In this period, the cultural impulses shaping Magadha seem to have been oriented largely westward. Epigraphic and paleographic evidence from inscriptions in late Gupta Brahmi shows continuity with northern and western Indian developments. The distribution of early medieval sculptural forms such as red sandstone and early schist images also aligns Magadha more closely with the western and middle Gangetic cultural zones during this time. The second phase, 9th to 11th century, corresponds to the height of the Pala influence. This period has the clearest imprint on the material and religious landscape of Magadha, and it is also the phase in which region's orientation shifts decisively eastward. The emergence and spread of the distinctive Pala-style sculptures, the predominance of black phyllite stone images, and the transition to Siddhamatrika script all signal the strengthening of eastern connections. The lack of coinage also hints of this eastward reorientation, as explored by John Dale in his discussion of a cashless or low coin monetized economy in Pala domains. This phase also marks the flourishing of monastic Buddhism in the Magadha region. Sites such as Nalanda, Udantapuri, Kurkihar, and Lakhisarai display clear ties with eastern India, both Bengal and the wider Buddhist networks stretching towards Burma and Southeast Asia. The third phase, 12th to 13th century, reflects a more fragmented political landscape. With the waning of Pala authority, Magadha entered a period marked by competing regional powers. The Gaharwas, the Senas, the Pittipatis, and a number of small lineages whose inscriptions and temple building activities begin to appear across southern Bihar. Materially, this period shows a partial swing back towards Western influence, especially in sculptural styles and epigraphic conventions. Eventually, the expansion of the Delhi Sultanate in the early 14th century absorbed the region into new administrative structures and further reshaped its cultural terrain. And I can go in more detail about why I say in 14th century, that's when the Delhi Sultanate really enters the Bihar region. Across these three phases, what becomes clear is that Magadha's inter-regional affiliations were far from static. They oscillated between western and eastern spheres of influence, and these shifts are detectable not only in political history, but also in paleography, sculptural traditions, religious networks, and patterns of patronage. For this presentation, I am concentrating on the middle phase of the 9th to 11th centuries, where the political geography of Magadha can be approached by following two patterns in material culture. First, the distribution of Pala-style sculptures. Second, spatial spread of medieval Buddhist monastic and pilgrimage sites across southern Bihar and adjoining regions. One reason this material approach becomes necessary is that textual and epigraphic reference to Magadha in the early medieval period tend to be inconsistent. Inscriptions referring to the term Magadha do not define its extent. Administrative units such as Magadha Desha, Nagara Bhukti, and Aṅga appear in terracotta ceilings and copperplate inscriptions at different moments, sometimes overlapping or being reconstituted from earlier territorial formations. These sources tell us that Magadha remained an important conceptual region, even though it had declined from its larger region from the earlier periods. But they leave open the question of where precisely its boundaries lay in this period. Material culture, however, anchors religious and artistic activity in concrete landscapes. By mapping where certain sculptural styles appear and just as importantly where they do not appear, we can begin to discern zones of cultural coherence that may correspond to historical regions. The early medieval period in eastern India is marked by a strong regional style. The black stone sculptures associated with the Palas have a distinctive iconographic and aesthetic vocabulary known as the Pala School of Art. I don't have any pictures of these sculptures, but we have seen plenty through other presentations, especially by Professor Claudine Bauze-Pichon. Their distribution across this region is not random. Available material indicates that outside of Bengal, early medieval sculptural production in the Pala style forms a dense, fairly continuous zone across southern Bihar. The Nalanda-Bihar Sharif corridor, Rajgir and its surrounding hills, Gaya and Bodh Gaya, and parts of Nawada, Lakhisarai, and Jamui show particularly high concentrations of these blackstone images, with unmistakably Pala iconographic and other technical features. These are the regions traditionally thought of as forming the heartland of Magadha. Yet we cannot simply assume that earlier conceptions of Magadha persisted unchanged into this period. We have to test these assumptions by looking carefully at adjacent landscapes where the material patterns change. One such landscape lies west of Son River. So your Son River is this one. In present-day Bhojpur, Rohtas, Kaimur and Sasaram region. This region extending until river Karmanasa, which is not appearing here, but you can kind of assume it's right over here, is sometimes considered part of Magadha. This is based on the presence of Dev Bernark inscription of Jivitagupta II, that's where the location is, which refers to Dev temple located west to the Son as part of the Nagar Bhukti division, which many scholars believe was reconstituted from the core region, from the former core territories of Magadha Desha. It is therefore possible that under the later Guptas of Magadha, which would be 6th to 8th century CE, Magadha extended further west, as well as was likely the case under the imperial Guptas as well. However, in contrast to the dense sculptural presence in southern Bihar, these western regions show the lack of the clear absence of Pala-style sculptures during the phase of 9th to 12th or 13th century CE. And more strikingly, the absence of Buddhist remains after the early post-Gupta period. Here we see a stronger presence of Shiva, Vishnu and Surya forms instead, suggesting a cultural environment distinct from the Buddhist-rich zones east of the river Son. What we lack, however, is systematic archaeological explorations in areas such as Aurangabad and Daud Nagar, around immediately east of the river Son, which hold potential to reveal whether the Son River functioned as a hard cultural boundary after the 8th-9th century shifts, or whether artistic and regional religious influences flowed more freely across this region than our current evidence suggests. If the western frontier is marked by absence, the eastern frontier gives us a different kind of story, one of continuity and connection. The Aṅga region, especially around Bhagalpur, Sultanganj, Kahalgaon, and to some extent Rajmahal Hills, shows sustained early medieval Buddhist presence, including substantial images of bodhisattvas, taras, and other esoteric forms, some stylistically close to the Magadhan center, and Professor Pichon has worked extensively on this subject. Mapping this eastern zone is crucial because it may help explain how and why Buddhism persisted in Magadha far longer than in regions west of Son and central India. It is possible that Magadha's continued Buddhist vitality in the early medieval period was sustained through connections to eastern networks extending towards Bengal, Burma, and into Southeast Asia. To the south, the forested and hilly zones of Chota Nagpur Plateau formed an ecological frontier but not an impermeable one. The impressive bronze hordes from Kurkihar is right there, located just south of traditional Magadhan core, indicates participation in wider monastic economies and artisan networks. And we know that there were monks from Kanchi region, from South India, that were present in Kurkihar. Other sites such as Hazaribagh and Itkhori raise the possibility that southern routes contributed both resources and pilgrims to Magadha's Buddhist institutions. Understanding these connections require integrating ecological zones into our historical maps rather than treating them as empty or marginal. Even the northern boundary of Magadha, often simplistically equated with the Ganga, and Ganga is flowing right here, deserve closer scrutiny. Regions north of the Ganga like Vaishali and Champaran have important early historic Buddhist remains but lack Pala period evidence. As a word of caution, it is important to note that the Mithila region has received limited scholarly attention for its early medieval remains. Consequently, this comparison may need to be re-evaluated in light of new discoveries, such as the Pala-style Buddha images found at Habidi in Darbhanga region, and I'm thankful to Shushmita for mentioning this site to me. However, these are sporadic findings in comparison to the Pala Buddhist material and monastic remains scattered across the southern Bihar region. Immediately south of the Ganga, although likely part of territorial boundaries of Magadha during the early medieval period, given that Gahadwals of Kannauj controlled Maner and Munger in the 11th century CE, it warrants further investigation. The Patna and Maner belt shows a continuous settlement history but fewer Pala-style sculptures than the southern heartland. Similarly, the Fatua, Bard and Bakhtiyarpur stretch overall demonstrates a later resurgence in building activities when Patna re-emerged as a riverine trade hub and eventually as a political center during the late medieval period. Further comparative diachronic work is needed to understand how these northern riverine landscapes relate to Magadha's shifting identity. What I hope to emphasize is not that what we already know about early medieval Magadha looked like cartographically, but that we now have a method capable of producing such knowledge by looking at these material remains and their pattern spread. By examining where sculptural and monastic activity clusters, where it declines or changes character, and where it intersects with ecological and economic boundaries or zones, we can begin to reconstruct a regional profile that textual sources alone cannot provide. This approach allows us to identify cultural gradients, zones of transition rather than fixed boundaries that may correspond closely to how regions functioned in practice. Several larger questions emerged from this material-based methodology. Did Magadha contract eastward over the early medieval centuries, as the sculptural evidence seems to suggest? How did the presence of Son River mediate cultural flows? Why did Buddhism remain deeply embedded in the Magadhan landscape even as political powers shifted around it? And what do the patterns of artistic production tell us about the economies of monastic establishments, artisan mobility, and regional patronage networks? These questions remain open, and the evidence needed to answer them is unevenly distributed, and of course a lot of fieldwork needs to be done. But the outlines of research agenda are becoming clear, and I hope a PhD student can take it from here and produce a detailed study out of it. Systematic documentation west of Son, deeper exploration of the Aṅga region, ecological integration of the southern plateau sites, and renewed archaeological attention to the northern Ganga belt is required. In conclusion, the framework I have outlined opens up a new way of approaching an underexplored aspect of medieval Buddhism in Bihar as well. That its early medieval form, concentrated in Magadha, was already a phase of revivalism. And pay attention to the word revivalism, which persisted due to its contact with the East. If we understand Magadha not as a static political unit, but as a dynamic cultural landscape shaped by all these artistic production, monastic economies, and regional networks, we can begin to trace how these eastern connections sustained Buddhist presence even as other regions saw its decline. The picture is far from complete, obviously, but by grounding our inquiry in the spatial logic of material culture, we move closer to reconstructed how Magadha functioned in the early medieval period and especially under the Pala influence, and why it remained central to the flourishing of medieval Buddhism in Eastern India. Thank you.
जिलाधिकारी का निर्देश है कि अगले पेपर के